Good evening. Thanks for joining us on From the Stacks tonight. I'm looking forward to a delightful conversation with our guest tonight, J. Scott Turner. We are the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation is a Christian ministry of scientists and economists and theologians working together to. Thanks for joining us on From the Stacks. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to turn the sound off someplace here so we don't have interference. Oh, come on. Here we go. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to turn the sound off someplace here so we don't have interference. I'm looking forward to it. There we go. Forgive me. Just back into this now. The Cornwall Alliance is a network of evangelical Christian scholars, scientists, economists, theologians, working to educate the public and policymakers on biblical earth stewardship, economic development for the very poor, and the gospel of Jesus Christ. We love to have conversations with all sorts of different people, including both Christians and non-Christians, people who see eye to eye with us and some people who don't. And I think that makes for interesting and often particularly eye-opening conversations. Before we bring in our guest, Scott Turner, this evening, I would like to inform you about a special offer from the Cornwall Alliance for the month of January. As our way of saying thanks when you make a donation of literally any size, we'd love to send you a magazine-sized study called China's Energy Dream by Patricia Adams. This is a really, I think, eye-opening, excellent study of how China is using the widespread fears of catastrophic global warming to further its own geopolitical interests, how it is not actually cooperating with the attempts to mitigate global warming, but instead is moving ahead with its own use of fossil fuels to build its economy, while it hopes to weaken the economies of the West by their own backing away from fossil fuels. To request your copy of China's Energy Dream, just go to cornwallalliance.org. That's cornwallalliance.org. Click on the donate button. And as you fill out the donation form, in the comments field, simply write in China's Energy Dream or promo code 22-01. We'll be glad to send you a free copy. Now, on to the subject for tonight. Our guest tonight is J. Scott Turner. He is a professor emeritus of biology and physiology at the State University of New York in Syracuse. And he's also just recently been named the director of the Diversity Project in the Sciences, or Diversity in the Sciences Project of the National Association of Scholars, an organization for which I have the highest regard. In fact, I've been a member of it off and on for almost 30 years now. And I'm delighted to see that Scott has been appointed to that position because he values the diversity that really matters, which is intellectual diversity, as distinct from skin color diversity or ethnic background diversity or gender diversity and so on. In matters of scholarship, what really matters is intellectual diversity. It's iron sharpening iron, to use a phrase out of the book of Proverbs. It's the importance of people with different ideas talking with each other, testing each other's ideas. Many of you will know that one of my favorite Bible verses is 1 Thessalonians 5:21, where the Apostle Paul wrote, "Test all things, hold fast what is good." And I think that's something that Scott Turner has been doing. So let's bring him on now. Scott has particularly been looking at the impact of politicization, often through government funding, of the sciences and of scientific endeavors. So without further ado, let's bring on Scott. Looks like we lost his picture there, but Scott, can you hear us? Can you speak to us?
I can hear you, and I hope you can hear me. For some reason, my Nikon webcam utility just decided to switch off. I'm sorry about that.
Well,
Um,
we
yeah,
can get that back up shortly, I trust. But
yeah,
meanwhile,
yeah. I can.
please just tell our listeners a bit more about yourself, your background, how it is that you came to do the kinds of things that you do.
Well, thank you, Cal. I'm delighted to be here. I would just add to your very comments about intellectual diversity and so forth that we can disagree vigorously, but it doesn't mean that we have to be mean to each other and be
Right.
insulting. Um, I beg your pardon. I'm just trying to get my camera back here. I know how to
No
do this
problem.
in Zoom, but I'm afraid I don't know how to do it in this. Anyway, so while I'm fiddling with this, let me just bring my microphone up so you can hear me. Can you still hear me all right? Is my audio
We
coming
can.
through still fine? Great.
That's coming through loud and clear.
Good. Okay. So yeah, you mentioned that one of the things I'm trying to do lately is, especially since I was retired, I retired about 2.5 years ago, is to take a broader look at the culture and the nature of the scientific enterprise in the academy, and my research career I lasted about 40 years, um, some of it in extended postdoctoral appointments, and I finally took up a regular faculty appointment in about 30 years ago. And I was sort of raised up in a particular tradition of how science should work. And among them were, you follow what are called the Mertonian norms. You are open to discussion, you share your data. Your priority above all is to ask nature questions about itself, and in a way that nature can give you back an honest answer, all those kinds of things. And for about the first 20 years of my career, my academic career, I was able to do that. I was able to engage in whatever research I wanted. I was free to follow my inquiries wherever they led. Where they led me actually was to the southern African country of Namibia, where I spent most of my research career working on the what I call the social physiology of termite colonies. There's some fascinating termite fauna down there, among them insects that build these huge mounds. They can stand up to 11 meters tall. Typically, they were on the order of maybe 3 or 4 meters tall in the area where I worked. And these mounds, not only are they prominent features of the landscape there, but they're also organs of physiology, which ties into my own basic interest as a physiologist. And they act as wind-driven lungs for the colony. And I spent many years trying to figure out just how it is that these colonies of social insects did that. And so that was my scientific career. And as part of that, it led me into some different kind of intellectual areas. For one thing, the whole Darwinian idea started to come into question for me. many people have worked on social insects, including Charles Darwin, and there's a kind of a little inside joke among biologists that if you work on social insects, you're bound to be driven crazy, and it did for Darwin, and it did a little bit for me as well, because it led me into some rather heterodox and actually non-Darwinian thoughts about how evolution worked, and so that's the intellectual side of me. But along the way, I began to see, and this is a very slow motion process, that the culture of academic science was changing dramatically. Um, the ability to be an independent adventure on the intellectual frontier, as I put it, became less and less important as the hustle to chase grant money to bring it into the university, and I was able to enjoy grant funding for my work for my entire career. My funding levels were rather modest. I didn't need a lot of money to be able to do my work, but nevertheless, I was under this relentless pressure to generate more and more money, and every one of my colleagues at the university face these things. And of course, you talk amongst each other at meetings and so forth. And this was a widespread phenomenon that a lot of people were noticing, and a lot of people were really troubled by, but they didn't really want to speak up. They wanted to keep their heads down,
Yeah.
do their work, and hope that it would all go away. And I was left wondering, well, why is this happening? What's going on here? And so I began delving into it, and among other things, I served as the executive chair of our faculty for a while. I tried to get into the finances of how we funded research. I met brick walls almost everywhere I turned, so obviously someone was trying to hide something, and so this led me to the article that you mentioned. That's the focus of this, Modern Science's Broken Bargain, and the argument there is basically that the sciences have betrayed not only their origins, but they're also betraying their proper social role. Science has a very valuable social role to play. It
Yes,
helps
indeed.
inform us about the nature of the universe. It helps us understand the universe better. It helps us ask deeper questions about our place in the universe, and so forth. And these were all things that I just loved about being a scientist. But that was gradually being submerged, and eventually, it was very clear to me that science in the academy and science in general really wasn't any longer about trying to understand life. It was about the self-perpetuating pursuit of money and power, and that's the
Yeah.
origin of the title. Modern Science's Broken Bargain. There was a kind of a social contract, informal social contract between scientists and the society that supports it, that prevailed for most of the history of science up until about the middle of the 20th century, and then the erosion of that ideal and that bargain, which began at the end of World War II with
Yeah.
the federal takeover, basically, of science, and it's now grown into, I argue, a full-blown crisis for
Yeah.
what science can do for society.
Yeah. And of course, it's fairly famously known that President Dwight Eisenhower warned of exactly that sort of a problem in his farewell address, where he
Yeah.
talked about how when government becomes the primary funder of science, then there are actually two risks involved that he named. One risk is that government sets the full agenda for science, and science therefore is politicized. But the other risk, he pointed out, excuse me, is that scientific experts then become sort of technocrats who take over the formation of government policy, I think often with an inadequate recognition of the value of input from outside their own spheres. Now, I don't want to get immediately to this particular topic, although you do mention it in your article, but I was very concerned from the very beginning when I saw that the coronavirus task force for the White House was essentially entirely medical experts. Well, obviously, it's a medical problem. We need a whole lot of medical expertise to address it. But missing were economists and sociologists and psychologists and lawyers, particularly constitutional lawyers, who could have helped to guide policy in ways that paid attention to the economic impact on individuals, families, businesses of the kind of lockdowns that were brought about, to the psychological impact on students of losing a year or two of in-class schooling, not just for the academic instruction that they would lose, but also for all the social interaction that they would lose with their peers. So many different things just were ignored because of a sort of a scientocratic or technocratic expertise that that pushed the development of those policies. But I'd like to now just bring us to the issue that you address in your article, which is in part a growing public distrust of science. 2 years ago, the Pew Research Center reported that 35% of Americans reported a great deal of confidence in scientists to act in the public interest, which was a remarkable 2/3 increase from just 3 years earlier. And another 51% reported a fair amount of confidence, for a combined 86%. Now, that's pretty cool, and yet there's been a bit of decay in that. And I've got two questions that I'd like to generate for us here to start with. First, how much does the actual practice of science, particularly on issues highly relevant to public policy, warrant that public confidence? If you could just address that one for us a little bit, Scott.
Sure. You mentioned Dwight Eisenhower's famous speech, and it's usually cast as the military-industrial complex, but
Right.
what's often left out is that he talked about the military-academic industrial complex, and he was absolutely prescient in that warning. But coming to the public trust issue that you mentioned, the sciences have traditionally enjoyed a great deal of trust from the public, and this is part of the informal bargain that I mentioned. There's roughly $125 billion per year that's funneled into university and other kinds of academic research, and the bulk of that comes from the federal government. A smaller proportion of it comes from institutional funds, from universities, which, if you follow the money, often boils down to federal money as well. And then there's a tiny fraction that comes from state governments and also from private foundations. Those last two, especially private foundations, used to provide the bulk of funding for science. And so the landscape of funding has shifted quite a bit. And in that pre-war era, when science was poorer, actually, great science was done. The image of scientists and science was very, very high. Lots of public trust, and part of the trust was motivated by the public perception that science adhered to these Mertonian norms. Science was disinterested. It was objective. It couldn't easily be stampeded by political or other kinds of governmental pressures. And
Right.
and that those are very admirable qualities, and that's where a lot of this public trust came from, and fortunately for scientists, that public trust has prevailed over the past 70 years since the end of World War II. And there's lots of reasons to admire the science that goes on. For the most part, scientists in the for about, I would say, 50 years after the end of World War II, maybe 45 or so, there were still enough scientists left over from that older era that they could bring their culture to the practice of science. But of course, the old joke that science proceeds according to the actuarial tables, that holds as true for the culture of science as it does for intellectual advance. As those generations have departed from the scene, the culture of rewards that most scientists work under has changed. It didn't begin 20 years ago, but it was actually built into the way that we fund science. But these first two generations after the war, they had enough of cultural confidence that they could resist the kinds of pernicious incentives or perverse incentives that were kind of lurking at the center of this. But no more. For about the past 20 years, as I said, the landscape of rewards has changed dramatically, and scientists have responded as rational actors to those changes, and among the changes has been a transition, what people have called a culture of discovery, which was, that discovery is the most important value. What determines the course of your career is largely the esteem of your peers. That esteem came independently from any kind of government or political agendas. And this has gradually changed into what is called a culture of productivity. You're now no longer judged by the discoveries of new knowledge that you make, but by measures of productivity like numbers of papers you publish, amount of grant dollars coming in, those kinds of things. And
How many
it's coming to the
citations
point.
of your papers?
How many citations, and it's come to the point where many academic departments are changing their criteria for promotion and tenure from a fairly rigorous examination of your intellectual contribution to a system where it's kind of fill in the box matrix for thresholds or goals to get to tenure. So you have to have so many papers, you have to bring in so many grant dollars, you have to have so many graduate students. All of these things are measures of productivity, which actually are quite alien to the whole process of discovery, and the high esteem that the public holds for science has survived that transition almost intact. And when we come to an issue where science plays a very important role in some very important public policy issues, for example, and Charles Murray ventured onto this turf many years ago with his publication of the bell curve. Climate change has been a major issue. All of these things, there's a very strong political dimension that actually governs the science rather than science informing the policy objectively with its with its dispassion and a distance from the political hurly-burly going on. And the COVID pandemic. Sure.
Let me ask you, how is it that that this changed paradigm of how one gains respect as a scientist from discovery and actual intellectual contribution to numbers of publications, amounts of grant money brought in, citations, and so on. Does that, in and of itself, uh, help to contribute to an erosion of what in your article you call the core attributes of science: unfettered freedom of intellect, cultivation of curiosity, skepticism, dispassionate reason, and dedication to evidence? Is there a way in which this cultural change in the evaluation of people's scientific work contributes to undermining the very essence of science itself?
Well, yes, it does. A friend of mine, Richard Lindzen, who was
Ah,
a climatologist at MIT.
yeah, we have a lot of
he's
friends in common. He's a friend of mine too.
well, maybe he said this to you as well. His provocative claim is that there's too much money in science,
Yeah,
and of course that's bound to raise hackles among all academic scientists. But I think he has a point. If you look at the pattern of funding of science, it's increased basically exponentially. It has a doubling time of about 7 years, and so every 7 years, the amount of money that we spend on science doubles, and the correlation of that doubling to the need for discovery of certain things is a little bit disjointed, and when you have this culture of productivity going on, you're rewarded by gaming the system in certain ways,
yeah,
and so the scientific publication, for example, um, is partly a communication of findings to peers, so that they can evaluate it, but it's also becoming increasingly what I call tokens for promotion and tenure. You have these
yeah.
publications, and it has a nice citation factor and H factor and these kinds of things, and that eventually accumulates as points towards being rewarded for
Yeah.
well, being rewarded with a promotion and tenure, and so rather than pushing out independently from the crowd, taking a risk, which is where great science comes from, what's rewarded is conformity to a particular goal of productivity. Never mind that the goal
Yeah.
of productivity has almost no relationship to scientific discovery. And so,
Is this,
scientists, shape their behavior according to the systems of rewards that they're working in.
yeah. Is this really all that new of a phenomenon? I'm thinking about Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And he certainly argues in uh, that major scientific paradigms tend to rise and fall, as you referred earlier, in terms of the actuarial table. How long does it take for a generation of scientists to die off, and then a bunch of new minds finally get to be free to think as they will? Um, the the sort of stranglehold that we're seeing money and politics put on science, how different is that from the stranglehold of scientific orthodoxies of the past?
Well, again, well, I can share some personal anecdotes
Sure.
for that. I worked at a forestry college, for example, and one of our big sources of blanket funding was was from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and they have a program which allocates certain funds to institutions which they are allowed to hand out to faculty, for example, or other programs to advance the cause of agriculture research. And in our case, it was forestry. So I came there as a young assistant professor, all eager, and I knew about this program. I'd been told about it, and I was developing an interest in termites by then. Now, I have to say that the termites were a new area for me. I'd never worked in them before, and so whenever you are coming into a new field, I was taking a risk. You have to have some credibility with peers. You have to publish things that I had not. So this seemed like a pretty good opportunity to start getting my research career with termites off the ground. And astonishingly, I was told that termites have nothing to do with forestry, and that was the first clue that oh gosh, maybe there's something else going on here. Now, that's just a very, very small example. The good news for me is I was able to find some money. A private organization, Earthwatch, stepped in to help with that. So credit for them, but it didn't come from a government funding program. Now, if we look at the broader scale, let's take climate change, which is, I'd say, the most egregious example. There's a great deal of money to be had in climate change research, and the way the government shapes the landscape, you've seen it in the promises of the new administration to dramatically increase the funding for climate change research. Okay, now there's lots of interesting questions to be asking about climate change. Climate change is a normal process. We don't really understand how it affects ecosystems, very complicated problems. So there are legitimate scientific questions to be asking there, but not $2 trillion worth of questions. But the money is there nevertheless. The pressure on scientists is to pursue that money and to bring it into the institution, because that increases the revenue stream that is coming into every institution of higher education is cash strapped these days, aside from places like Harvard or Yale or Princeton. And so the pressure is very strong. You have to find funding to be able to study climate change. And you won't get the grant if you come into the climate change question as, I'm not entirely convinced that climate change is an issue, I want to study the effects of past climate on populations of organisms. And I have a friend in South Africa, for example. He was studying some of the indigenous plants there. His grant was to study the effects of climate change on this unique community of plants, and he confided in me once that the results are coming out completely contradictory to what I would have expected for climate change. And I don't really want to publish because I'm going to get into trouble with this. And so there's this constant financial pressure to pursue the money, whether there's an interesting question there or not. Some of the research that's funded is actually pursuing interesting questions. There's still, scientists with integrity and dedication to the norms of science out there studying this question. My friend from South Africa is one example of that. But there's also a great deal of money, and people will find ways to use that money, and so therefore the amount of money that's going in to support a particular political agenda is increasing, and you have no shortage of politicians who are eager to jump in and claim the mantle of science as justification for this. And of course, the example of this that made me want to tear out my hair was Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez saying that we have scientists say that we have 12 years to save the planet. Now, I know of no scientist who actually says this, and yet,
Yeah.
she's in a position where she can influence the flow of money to colleges and universities, and that's going to shape what goes on there. And so, that's an example of how this kind of thing can actually shape science. And so.
Yeah, I referred earlier to the Pew Research Center report that 86% of Americans have either a great deal or a fair amount of confidence that scientists act in the public interest. And I'd just like to explore for a minute just what does it mean for scientists to, quote, act in the public interest? And, and how might the very pursuit of that, granted that perceptions of public interest can differ enormously, how might the pursuit of that be itself an endangerment to the proper practice of science?
The pursuit of the public interest?
Yeah,
Are you
yeah.
asking about? Yeah.
The public interest in the abstract. I mean, if we just say, okay, here's this thing that we're going to call the public interest. Well, to pursue that, I think is probably just fine. But when we equate the public interest with this or that particular public policy, supported by this or that party, this or that candidate, this or that office holder, then for science to act in pursuit of the public interest or in service of the public interest seems to me to be a significant risk of undermining the very freedom of intellect, cultivation of curiosity, skepticism, dispassionate reason, and dedication to evidence that are the hallmarks of real science.
Yeah, and in part, there's been quite a bit of mission creep, if you will, again fueled by the very generous funding of scientific research, again mostly by the federal government, and among them is pressure on universities to be all things to all people, and sometimes things that they are not intended to be. And so some of the founding documents for the launch of what I call the Big Science era, which started at the end of World War II, the way this was sold to the public was that we would need to support generously basic science, that is curiosity-driven research that was in a sense kept at arm's length from industry and from government and so forth. And so in the founding manifesto, if you will, of the Big Science era, universities were intended to play a very specific role. They were intended to support basic research. Basic research had given us the atom bomb. It had given us all kinds of other technological marvels. And so that was the argument that, well, we need to have more basic research to basically win the peace after the war had been won. Now, prior to that, universities had played that role. There were other actors. For example, science is often touted as a generator of new products and a source of economic stimulus, for example. We saw this argument made especially hard during the space program. Everyone knows about the role of Velcro. This is an example that's trotted out. Something to hold tools in place in a weightless environment that had eventually had all these wonderful uses, and so industry had a role in developing products. This was most interestingly exemplified in Bell Labs, who, among other things, invented the transistor. Probably the most fundamentally transforming discovery of the 20th century. And Bell Labs had a very interesting ethos with respect to the industry. You know, they were run by AT&T. AT&T sent them off separately. They did not claim patent rights. The discoveries from Bell Labs are all open in the public domain. And, you know, if you look at the business climate there, that was a very rational thing for them to do because, you know, they had the monopoly on the transmission lines, obviously. But nevertheless, you know, people could take semiconductor technology and basically run with it. They weren't constrained by proprietary patent laws. And then science for the public interest, you know, things like, well, we need to understand how airfoils work. We need to understand how to grow plants. We need to understand how to keep people healthy, all those kinds of things that have a very clear public benefit. That had been run mainly through government research laboratories, from the precursor of the National Institutes of Health, where Anthony Fauci is a director. Also, you know, organizations like NASA. We want to fly to the moon. We want to fly around the skies. NASA is going to do the science necessary to tell us how to do that safely, and so forth. You know, all these kinds of things. And they were more or less separate in the pre-war era. People could go from place to place. You know, for example, some of the luminaries in the development of semiconductor technology, for example, they worked in Bell Labs for a bit. William Shockley spent some time in Stanford as an academic, and they would bounce back and forth between these things. And that's how the kinds of cross-fertilization that gives, you know, that generates all the wonderful things that science is supposed to do came from. Along came the federalization of the sciences after World War II, along with a kind of a burgeoning financial crisis. And all of these things came to reside, all the hopes for these things came to reside in the universities. So universities were no longer expected just to be centers for basic research. They were expected to invent things so that patent income could be derived from them. They were expected to be politically active, you know, to be engaged with the political realm, and of course ecology back in the 1970s, you know, that was called the subversive science, you know, because it supposedly undermined, you know, all the assumptions of the capitalist economy that we live in. Excuse me, and so all of these things came to be embodied in the university. And the fact is, universities aren't really very good at a lot of those things. You know, for example, universities were allowed, I think in the 1980s, to keep patent rights for themselves, even if the research had been paid for by the government. Yet universities don't actually know very well how to do that. Private companies know how to make money out of these things. But if someone had a crucial patent, for example, and it belonged to the university would hold on to that, and it would actually be an impediment to economic development, because they weren't doing what Bell Labs did, which is to put this intellectual property out there. When it comes to public health, you know, university scientists are expected to be engaged in public health issues, you know, and this is where the whole issue of environmental justice, which is a bit of an odd concept to my mind. This is where that comes in, and so, you know, it's got to the point where I've actually seen proposals that, well, if you want to have tenure in a university, you have to generate patents. You know, you have to generate these kinds of things, and decisions on tenure should be governed by how many patents you have generated. Now, of course, never mind that completely undermines all the other non-science things that are supposed to go on in a university, and the humanities, and, you know, things that are very valuable in a university setting. And so, you know, basically there have been proposals to turn the universities into modern versions of Bell Labs. labs, never mind what the traditional mission of the university should be. And because there's money behind it, and there's political power behind it, this poses, I think, a grave threat to what universities are supposed to be, and to the kind of informal social bargain that has been struck between science and the universities, over an assumption that universities will be these areas of dispassionate inquiry, of objective advice, of all these kinds of things.
Yeah, one of the things that you write about in this article on modern science's broken bargain is how the intrusion of identity politics into the sciences has made it toxic. This trend toward a politicization of science. You go on to say distinguished scientific careers are snuffed out in an instant. Farther down, you say conformity and risk aversion, behaviors once alien to the scientific enterprise, are now pervasive, enforced in star chamber human resources inquisitions. Um, in terms of your new position with the National Association of Scholars, which I think is just wonderful to see, your position in terms of director of the Identity in Science project, or Diversity in Science project. Um, Tell us about this intrusion of identity politics into the sciences. And do you have some examples for us of, you know, uh, people whose careers are snuffed out through a sort of a star chamber process?
Well, let's turn to some examples first. I've documented some of these for an article that will be coming out in February, that I wrote for a large report that is being put out by the Heritage Foundation, and so there are many famous, several high-profile examples of people facing this kind of thing. One of them is a professor of biochemistry, I think it is, Tim Hunt, who by all accounts, was supportive of bringing women into the sciences. Checked all the right boxes, and he was at a conference in Japan. While he was introducing a speaker, he told a joke that by I think all standards was teasing but fairly benign. Everyone in the room, except for one person, many of whom were women, had a good laugh at the joke. But there was one person who took offense at it, and as Tim Hunt was flying back from Japan to England, he was informed that, well, he'd been removed from his position as an advisor to an important committee in the university, all without any kind of due process. And so that's one example. Larry Summers, who was president of Harvard, who actually dared to bring up the idea that, well, maybe if women aren't going into math and engineering, maybe it's because women really aren't interested in going into math and engineering. And of course, you saw the hullabaloo that arose from that.
Yeah.
And of course, Larry Summers is quite far along on the liberal side of the spectrum. He's not a conservative or racist or sexist by any means. But if you delve more deeply into this, and groups like the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education have been doing yeoman's work on this, compiling cases of scientists who had been canceled, but because they weren't high-profile people, the name didn't generate big news headlines like Tim Hunt's and Larry Summers' cancellation did, and these cases number into the hundreds over the past 10 years or so, and so there is this pervasive notion that, well, if you don't conform to this ideology, then we will your career will be damaged. And when you have someone who is a tenured professor, for example, it's actually very hard to remove tenure from a person, of course, in the absence of moral turpitude or things like this, even telling some
Yeah.
off-color joke, but there is a very handy way to do that, and that's to charge the person with the violation of Title IX. And this is an obvious conflict between freedom of expression and civil rights law. And the way it's resolved actually is that civil rights law always prevails. There's this idea that when you talk about constitutional rights of freedom of expression and so forth, these are constitutional rights, but they don't have to be enforced in every place. They don't have to be enforced in workplaces, for example. Yet Title IX is enforced everywhere, and so the Department of Justice can, as we've seen, can impose whatever bizarre interpretations to Title IX that they wish, and you have to conform, or you can be dragged in front of a human resources tribunal and be got rid of that way. And so it's a very chilling climate for what should be a kind of intellectually anarchic atmosphere in the sciences, where look, I'm free to look at whatever wherever my curiosity leads me, no matter what the conclusions, no matter what the political implications of it, and so forth. And that's under grave threat in the universities right now. Now, when it comes to funding institutions, I was part of a large NSF competition a while ago for what's called a research center. It's basically it's a multi-million-dollar grant to fund a consortium of different universities towards a particular end. And part of that is that you apply for these things in two stages. You first apply for what's called a development grant, and you get money to basically come to a conference in Washington where you're informed, these are the elements of a successful proposal. This is how we'll be judging your proposal, and so forth. And at this conference, they, as part of this, there were 4 pillars that they would, as they called it, that would be the criteria for judgment, and most of them were fairly, standard scientific kinds of things, but then one of them was diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we were told in no uncertain terms that unless we're satisfied with this, there is no way that you can count on having a successful proposal here. This is going to be determinative, and so naturally, if you want the money, you have to conform to that ideology. It comes in many more subtle forms. For example, if you're an aspiring academic scientist and you want to apply for a university position, more and more you're finding that you have to sign or make a diversity statement, or even sign a loyalty oath that you'll conform to the ideology of the university. And of course, we all got very upset back in the 1950s. Not me personally, because I was less than 10 years old then, but it's the same kind of loyalty oath applied to another political agenda, namely anti-communism, was roundly denounced by the very same people who are pushing this. And also embedded within grant proposals is the expectation that you will, in your broader impacts of research that you have to write about, you will include how you're going to meet diversity, equity, and inclusion aims. And so this is being pushed onto the universities very forcefully by political interests backed up by lots and lots of money, much of which actually comes from the revenue stream that the sciences are generating for universities. And pretty soon, the scientist has no power anymore. The scientist can think or say whatever he wants, but unless his behavior and speech conforms to this kind of thing, there'll be trouble waiting for you in the future. And
Yeah.
again, it imposes a very chilling climate of fear and self-censorship and those kinds of things that is just going to be the death of the ideals of science in the academy. And somehow it has to be reversed.
Yeah. Somehow it has to be reversed. That leads right into the next question that I have for you. Very late in your article, you say the 70-year experiment to federalize the sciences has been a failure. The task now is to prevent the Big Science Cartel from further dehumanizing society and delegitimizing science. Okay, if that's our task, how do we do it? How do we get there from here?
Well, that's a very good question. That's part of what we're going to try to undertake at the National Association of Scholars. It's the typical dilemma of a junkie. Universities are addicted to this stream of revenue. There are a lot of people who are supported by this, who derive their livings from it. A lot of very deserving people, great scientists, and so forth. So, but everyone's wrapped up into this kind of ball of collusion, and that is basically the Big Science Cartel. Everyone depends upon having the stream of money continuing uninterrupted and even increasing. And so I've seen lots of instances where people within the academy have recognized this and are troubled by it, and even have gone to great lengths, at great courage, to try to bring the necessary reforms about. But all the power, all the institutional power and money rests with this Big Science Cartel. So it's going to be very hard to get from where we are now, which is at the end of a multi-decades-long experiment in federalizing science, which has, among other things, yielded the rather poisonous fruits that we're seeing right now in science.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we get back to this earlier era, which wasn't perfect, but nevertheless, existed in a culture that promoted the ideals of what science and academic science should be. And it's going to be a very difficult transition. So among the things that we're looking at is ways to re-empower scientists and faculty, for example. Right now, scientists are just employees. They have no power. Tenure is an illusory protection for you. And a part of this is that if you don't bring in the money, irrespective of how brilliant or creative you are, you're gone. And universities have the power to enforce that right now. So one possible way is to, excuse me, start decoupling the power of universities from scientists' interests, so that scientists can now have the kinds of power that they should be enjoying. They should be co-equal partners with universities in the advance of this agenda, but they're not. They're subordinates to the interests of the university. So, maybe scientists can apply for grants independent of universities' interests, as independent contractors, for example. One idea that we're going to be looking at is, instead of giving a scientist tenure when he or she has demonstrated enough wherewithal to be able to undertake high risk and intellectually important research. Don't give them tenure, because tenure doesn't matter anyway. Instead, give them shares in a corporation so that they now have economic power behind them, and that might tempt universities to, well, maybe we shouldn't go after this unpopular guy because he told a rude joke a few years ago, or because now it will cost us money. If he's going to go, we have to buy this person out, and there's going to be tangible disincentives to that. Another pernicious thing that goes on in academia is something called academic mobbing. There's been several studies of this, and basically it's like all the chickens pecking to death the outlier, and of course outliers are what you need to have. And if you had a kind of a shareholding structure, much like law firms and medical practices do, then going after someone as an academic in an academic mobbing is going to subject you to tangible financial penalties, and maybe that can bring respect back. There are some other things as well that we're looking in, but the real problem is that we have so changed the culture of science, as I said, from this ethic of discovery to an ethic of productivity, that somehow we have to get in and dismantle that culture of productivity to allow the culture of discovery to arise once again.
Yeah, we're basically at the top of the hour, which doesn't necessarily mean that we have to stop. If you're willing to give us another 10 minutes or so,
Of course.
I'd love
Yeah,
to
of course.
move
Yeah.
on to something else. And I think this relates to our prior conversation. We talked about it a little bit before we went on the air, if this is what is meant by going on the air anymore. But you have shown some real independence in your own thinking by giving respect to the intelligent design movement, despite the fact that, in fact, in the end, you disagree. You think that they're wrong, but you've spoken to me of your high regard for Steve Meyer, for others in the ID movement. In fact, in my undergraduate work, I studied under Dallas Willard, a philosophy professor at the University of Southern California, who really encouraged Philip Johnson to move from his book Darwin on Trial to his book Reason in the Balance, which in a sense kind of launched the ID movement, the intelligence design movement, making an argument that, that if matter and energy in motion is all there is, then it's really hard to figure out how reason occurs, how reasoning occurs. In a fairly simple layman's way of putting it, C.S. Lewis said, look, naturalism is the argument that there is no such thing as argument. Because, gee whiz, if two billiard balls meet on a table, they don't exactly sit down and have a cup of tea and talk about which direction and at what velocity each one will go afterward. They just exchange energy and off they go. And if that's the character of everything that's happening in the universe, it's really difficult to figure out how we figure anything out. How do we trust our reasoning? And so I'd like you to just, if you would, tell us a little bit about how it is you went from, I think you did refer earlier to your own background, from someone who pretty thoroughly bought into the Darwinian paradigm, the not just in terms of the biology, but in terms of worldview, in terms of underlying philosophy, to somebody who has shown real respect to the intelligent design movement, but you're offering a different alternative where you're arguing that there's design, but it's arising from within rather than being imposed from without.
Yeah, as you mentioned, I was trained as a scientist, very much in the Darwinian tradition, and as a result, I was immersed in what's really a very sophisticated body of thought. Endless fascination in exploring the ideas that have been built up around Darwinism for decades, literally. And so, I come into the position where I am now from a position being embedded in this culture of the Darwinian idea, and I should go a little bit further and say that the Darwinian idea came from a deliberate uh, de- a deliberate attempt by Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace to try to make evolution a mechanism, and basically into the same atomistic tradition, if you will, that physics and chemistry are bound up in. Now, I trained as a physiologist interested in evolution, and that comes from an entirely different philosophical tradition. Among the Socratic philosophers, there are two what I call purposeful philosophies. One of them is Plato, of course, and the other one is Aristotle, and my science of physiology has some rather deep roots in the Aristotelian tradition, but the notion that there is such a thing as purposefulness, there is such a thing as design, is embedded in that philosophy, even though a lot of physiologists don't care to admit that. Now, Platonism, of course, was the other purposeful philosophy that we inherited from the Socratics. And when we talk about intelligent design theory, that's very much embedded in that Platonic tradition. And prior to the time that Charles Darwin went on his voyage of the Beagle, the dominant Platonic philosophy then was William Paley's natural theology, his famous analogy of the watchmaker. You look at the incredibly complex and ingenious contrivance of a watch. You're led necessarily to reflect on the nature of the watchmaker, and so design and nature, according to the natural theology idea, is a reflection of the mind of the creator. And okay, so that's a philosophy, and intelligent design falls squarely into that. Now, when it comes to the controversies between standard evolutionism and intelligent design theory, you're really talking about two very different philosophical traditions. So you have the Darwinian idea, which denies altogether, a priori, any notion of intelligence or purposefulness or those kinds of things, as you mentioned. And then you have a very strongly purposeful philosophy, of which intelligent design is an example of a resurgence of that philosophy. And there are two diametrically opposed camps, and no surprise, anyone who is a believer or a Christian or in any way religious is sort of shunned from the club, from the Darwinian club, if you will. Sometimes it's quite subtle. Sometimes it's quite hard and brutal. But if you're going to be a scientist, you have to make a choice. You have to come into this philosophical camp, and you can't associate with those in the other philosophical camp. Now, when you talk about physiology, as I said, this is another purposeful philosophy, and among the things that are of interest here is, well, just how does life behave in a purposeful way? How does it come about? And one of the strong foci of that is is this whole issue of biological design. If you look at the structure of animals, let's say, the dimensions of the bones of the leg, for example, they occur in the dimensions that you would expect a civil engineer would specify in say,
Mhm.
the dimensions of a column that had to hold up a certain weight, and and these kinds of things. And so the inference of design is almost undeniable. But in the Darwinian idea, this is treated almost as an illusion. Oh, this is just our pattern building brain, invoking something that doesn't really exist, that natural selection um, uh, explains it all. And that never really sat well with me. That's why I wrote uh, this book, The Tinkerer's Accomplice, saying that no, design is a real thing.
Yeah.
It doesn't have an explanation that you can get strictly from chemistry and physics. And that caused a little bit of a firestorm. This came out. You can see on the screen the subtitle: "How Design Emerges from Life Itself." This came out just a year after people's feelings were still rubbed kind of raw with the Dover, Pennsylvania intelligent design issue, and we had difficulty finding reviewers for the book because it just mentioned the word design, and basically invoking things that kind of nasty things about what I thought was a legitimate scientific question. And one of the things that happened was that Steve Meyer, to give him credit, invited me to say, well, why don't you come down to our next conference? And it was in Pennsylvania, of all places, not in Dover, but and it was just a marvelous conference. It was not by any means a theological conference. We had lots of interesting thinkers there, from Stuart Kaufman, people who had been involved in the historical debate about natural selection that had taken place in the 1950s. And it was just a very, very stimulating conference. And
Yeah.
I came to the conclusion that what I had in common with intelligent design theory. I'd been branded with that brush already by colleagues, but what I had in common was that we both, from different perspectives, had come to the same conclusion that you cannot explain evolution without invoking some kind of cognitive intelligence, and we have to be fairly broad in what we call cognitive intelligence. My own work as a physiologist has led me to conclude that all life is cognitive at root. It has a thermodynamic and a chemical and a physical operation, but at root it's a cognitive phenomenon. And when you approach it in this way, you are just led almost immediately into the idea that life has intelligence, and or that life reflects intelligence, and so that's what we have in common. So what I often say to Steve when we have these discussions is that, well, you're a Platonist and I'm an Aristotelian. I'm a friendly critic, but I'm still a critic. And, and this is where the point of difference lies.
Yeah.
And he's been very open, and we're friends, and all that. We get along well, we respect each other, and all those kinds of things. And I just wish that my colleagues who are still embedded deeply in the Darwinian idea would extend the same respect to people like Steve. And I mean, it's just an idea after all. Talking about ideas is what we
Yeah.
as academics are supposed to do. But
Yeah.
the unwillingness to talk to anyone in the intelligent design fraternity is something that's actually kind of deeply disappointing to me.
Yeah.
So that's where that
You
stands. And yeah,
back in
go on.
2007, in the Chronicle of Higher Education, you wrote an article called "Why Can't We Discuss Intelligent Design?" And this kind of was in the midst of sort of the movement among a lot of Darwinians to just sort of paint intelligent design as as only embraced by knuckle draggers, so to speak. Uh, and you had what I thought was a very, very interesting sentence just in the fourth paragraph down. You said, unless clearly linked to the process of natural selection, design, quote and unquote, can be a bit of a red flag for modern biologists. And as I read that, I thought to myself right off, why does this happen with regard to apparent design in plants and animals, but it doesn't happen with regard to apparent design in novels and airplanes?
That's a very interesting perspective. I just want to add that article was written in the aftermath of the president of Cornell University actually revoking the charter of a group of students, of all people, who wanted to have a discussion about this, and which I thought was extremely illiberal. And again, this is another, tick in the box of my concern about what's happening to higher education. But when you talk about design in airplanes and other kinds of things, these are obviously human-built creations, and they come from very clear processes of intelligence and foresight, and being able to work solutions and these kinds of things. And we're sort of lulled into the idea that this is something that's unique to human beings, that we are so far removed intellectually or with brain power from the rest of the world that it's okay to talk about design when we are referring to our own designs, but it's not okay to talk about design when we see it arising in other contexts, like the design of bones, for example. And again, how do you draw the distinction? On what basis do you justify design in one case and not in the other? And part of the problem is that there's a prevailing confusion in modern biology and maybe philosophy as well, that consciousness is somehow the same as cognition, and they're really entirely different things. They have to be related somehow, but they are very, very different things. Consciousness is something that's very idiosyncratic. I know I'm conscious, but I'm not entirely sure that you might be, for example. I think my dog is conscious to something, but his lived experience, conscious experience, is different from mine. There's simply no doubt about it. But my dog acts in a purposeful way, and the deeper you go into it, you see that the processes that give rise to cognition and consciousness in ourselves are really indistinguishable from similar kinds of processes that take place in almost any living creature. And when I say this, I'm talking about all the way down to the level of the bacterium. And there's a phrase that pops up around the fringes of biology. It's called universal cognition. That cognition is this fundamental property of life, and you can only dismiss the one from our own by conflating consciousness with cognition. So we consciously design things. We know what we're doing. We can think things through in our conscious minds and the little man inside our head. But the processes that are going on to this are fundamentally cognitive processes, taking information, interpreting it, taking action to modify the surroundings, and so forth. All those things happen all the way down from the most complex brain to the simplest collection of bacteria. And when you assert that life is fundamentally a cognitive phenomenon, design is something that pops out of that almost effortlessly. You can, it's no real hurdle to be able to invoke actual design in living things, because the processes that do it there also give rise, or also operate in our own nervous systems and cognitive systems, and the consciousness part is very interesting but very mysterious epiphenomenon that is sort of plastered on the top of that very complex cognition in ourselves, and so if someone wants to argue that, oh, well, bacteria are really fundamentally different from us, they're so simple that they can't possibly be intelligent, I think that argument falls apart if you take a particular view of what intelligence is. You have to be very broad in your
Yeah,
definition of it, of course, and I push it as far as I think I can get away with. But it's still a fundamental phenomenon, I think.
yeah,
And of course, this
I
is one
think
of
the
the
very
reasons why
notion that bacteria are in any way simple is itself
it's true.
pretty astounding.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely, yeah, absolutely, yeah,
you know, some
yeah.
some of the intelligent design proponents, like molecular biologist Douglas Axe in his book
Hmm.
uh,
Hmm.
"Undeniable: How Biology Confirms Our Intuition That Life is Designed," modify the argument, moving, I think, beyond and a bit differently from, say, Behe and his Darwin's black box, uh, by pointing out that genetic material displays not only order or complexity or order and complexity, but actually what we can only call information. And then he argues that as distinct from simple order and complexity, however complex that order might be, information is something that we seem to find coming only from actual consciousness, actual minds, um, as distinct. It seems to me that that would be a little bit distinct from what you're talking about. Um, just what do you think of that?
Well, I know Doug Axe personally, and
Ah,
he's in the same rank to in my opinion, to Steve Meyer. Very intelligent guy. I think he's done some very interesting work related to, the probability of particular changes of nucleotides and what that means for the origins of novel function, for example. And he poses. The question experimentally in a very interesting way, and in a way that is hard to refute. And so he makes a point that I'm fully in agreement with. It's simply undeniable that there's intelligence at work in the phenomenon of life and all aspects of it, including its function and its evolution and so forth. But um, I think the jury is still out on what the experimental work that he's done actually means, and this might seem a little bit arcane, but it's one of the points of criticism that I have for intelligent design theory.
okay.
The big thing with standard Darwinian evolution is that the code, that is this nucleotide sequence in DNA, is something that specifies function, and it can only go one way. You have the code that's translated, and then it's transcribed, and then it's translated into function of some sort. So if you're going to get any kind of change, evolutionary change, that has to be accompanied by a change in the code somehow. And there's lots of ways that those changes in code can come about. And that's a shortcoming of the Darwinian idea, I think. Because there's more to life than the code. I mean, the code is just an object. It's not the process of life. DNA is just a molecule. Unless it's embedded in a living system, you can bottle it and have it sit on a shelf, and it won't be any different. But when you take Doug Axe's work, for example, it's still very focused on the code, and some of the initial explorations of this were, as I think, as focused on the code as Darwinians were, and I think that focus has led Darwinism into a real trap, and and I think the similar focus from the other side leads intelligent design theory into a similar trap. Now, what they have right, in my view, is a focus on information, but they don't go quite far enough, I think, because they're not exploring very much how that information is translated into a living being, into adaptation, all these kinds of things. And when you look at the relationship between the structure of DNA and the function of DNA, DNA has a function, and the kind of environment in which DNA operates, you know, we find that it's not so nearly, well, it's not at all as linear as we have always thought. You know, you don't have much specified in the code of a DNA as it's turned into function. It can be interpreted. Context is important. It can be modified. You can even get feedback of the metabolism of the cell onto the very definition of the gene. So we're coming into a new definition of the gene, which is very, very flexible. You know, not at all the kind of specific determinism that the sort of classic conception of the gene has done. And when you make the final connection that, well, what's influencing the environment that DNA is experiencing actually is a cognitive phenomenon. You know, the cell is taking in information about the state of the environment. It's using that information to modify its metabolism, and then these modifications can actually feed back and not only modify DNA, but actually define an entirely new gene. Then you have a situation where information now becomes translated into process, which is what life really is, you know, including the gene. You know, the gene is not so much a specifier of function as it's a participant in function. This is the whole idea behind the growing epigenetics revolution. And when that happens, you know, then you do have a source for where that structure of DNA, where the code comes from, that doesn't depend upon some abstract notion of information. You have to translate information into process, and when you do this, then a hypothesis emerges that, oh well, we can maybe explain the information this way, and these are the implications of it. Now, this is by no means proven, but one thing it does, I think, is it provides kind of a common ground between the kind of genetics-driven evolution that has been the traditional Darwinian idea, and the kinds of arguments that are coming from the intelligent design theory. That, you know, yes, there's physiology involved. Yes, there's mechanism involved. Yes, it's embedded in a mechanistic and physical world, which a reductionist approach can help us understand to some degree. But in the middle of this, there's this area of intelligence, and you know, geneticists don't like to talk about intelligence because it seems spooky and ethereal. But yet it's there. You know, you cannot. I would argue, explain life without acknowledging, frankly, that there is intelligence at work. And you know, my hope is that, you know, maybe we can avoid spectacles like the Dover case in the future, because there actually is a common ground for you know, people who are concerned about the materialism and nihilism, basically, of the Darwinian idea, and the idea that there actually is a purposeful, or there is a purpose to life, and you know, we just need to figure out how that works.
Yeah, one of your books, let's see, was, I'm looking for that title. No, not The Tinkerer's Apprentice, but one recently on purpose. What was the title of that, Scott?
Purpose and Desire. Purpose and Desire,
Yeah.
that one?
There you go.
Yeah.
Purpose and desire.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
fascinating. I'm looking forward myself to getting into reading that. Uh, I guess something that's occurred to my mind repeatedly as we've spoken about this is the question, okay, but then where did that come from? Where did that come from? And it reminded
Yeah.
me, just to end on a humorous note, of a statement, quote from Jonathan Swift in his poems. This one from "The vermin only tease and pinch their foes superior by an inch." He says, "Big fleas have little fleas upon their backs to bite them, and little fleas have lesser fleas, and so ad infinitum." My
Yes.
philosopher friend, John Warwick and Montgomery, paraphrased that a bit. He said, "Bigger bugs have littler bugs upon their backs to bite them, and littler bugs have littler bugs, and so ad infinitum." At any rate, Scott, this has been a delightful conversation. I've really enjoyed it. I think it's wonderful to find people who disagree with each other and yet can do so respectfully and even jovially, and that's just good. That's good fun. It's part of what ought to be making us human, or rather, part of what our being human ought to generate. So, thank you very, very much for joining us tonight, and I wish you very well in your work with the National Association of Scholars. If you get a chance to mention to the president of the National Association that we connected here, that'd be fun. He's an old friend.
I will.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
so
Well,
thank you again.
let me just say,
Any
okay, let me
closing
just say,
comments?
well, I mean, let me just say that this is the kind of conversation that is the biggest reward of being an academic.
Yeah.
Nothing is served by rancor. All it does is close minds, and the way to open minds is to have these kinds of conversations. And I really enjoyed it, and I appreciate you reaching out to me. And this has been a wonderful hour and a half for me.
Great.
So thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much. And J. Scott Turner, thank you so much for joining us. There's a Scott Tinker who's an energy specialist, who's somebody else I'm going to be having on this program.
Oh,
But
okay. All right. Yeah.
thank you so much for
Okay.
joining us tonight.
Thanks
All of
again.
you
Thanks
who
again, Cal.
yeah, thank you. All of you who were able to stick with us through this time, I would just remind you that the Cornwall Alliance, throughout the month of January, is offering to send you a free copy of this study, China's Energy Dream, as our way of saying thank you when you make a 100% tax-deductible donation of literally any size and request it. To request your own copy, all you need to do is to go to cornwallalliance.org. That's cornwallalliance.org. Click on the Donate button. And as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, just enter promo code 22-01. That's promo code 22-01, or the title, China's Energy Dream. We'll be glad to send you a copy of this. It is a really stunning expose of how China is using the West's fixation on man-made climate change as a crisis and existential threat to undermine the economic prosperity of the West, while it continues to build its own economy and its own military. The aim being to become, as was put forward in the Chinese idea called the 100-year marathon, that China would become the world's supreme and actually only superpower by the year 2049, which is the 100th anniversary of the Communist Revolution in China. So I would really encourage you to read this and to share it with many others. Our guest next week will be Patricia Adams, the author of China's Energy Dream. So I'm really looking forward to that conversation and hope that you will be joining us then. Until then, thanks very much for joining us. God bless you.